This is a review of the 1952 Alexander McKendrick film Mandy, also known as Crash of Silence. This is a movie about a deaf girl named Mandy, young child, born unable to hear, and her parents, who are trying to cope with this shocking turn of events, and a school and its faculty that specialize in deaf children, and a lot of politics, a lot of twists and turns that have to do with all of this. This is a pretty cool movie. If you like 1950s movies, then this has some uncommon elements to it, and I would maybe suggest watching this movie. But before we talk about the movie really at all, there's a huge asterisk that we should probably address, which is that this movie depicts and really preaches a very particular kind of deaf education called oralism, which has gone out of favor. When I think it's sort of in the 1960s, new methods came to light, and these days I don't think oralism is seen in a very positive light for reasons that make a lot of sense. Essentially, the idea with oralism, or the oral method, is that you should teach deaf people to speak so that they can participate in a society effectively, or something along those lines. Now, the tricky thing about it was that this was viewed, the idea was that they should speak rather than using sign language. And so at schools, it was sign language was often forbidden. So they would make deaf students wear special white gloves that sort of like mittens, I think, where it made it very difficult to sign and to communicate. The idea was really speech above all else, and students who were not able to learn to speak were seen as dumb, seen as failures, seen as failed students who would never be able to integrate into society, were put in sort of separate remedial, non-speaking classes. This was replaced by a method or something called total communication, I think, which embraced the rather sane idea that people should communicate in whatever means is best. But there's a lot of interesting history, which I'm definitely not an expert on. But there's, for instance, Alexander Graham Bell, whose wife was deaf, was a huge proponent of the oral method and may have really done a lot of harm to early education for the deaf by some of the policies that he was able to use his influence to create and further. This movie goes all in on oralism, basically, and that's not ideal. But you probably aren't watching a movie from 1952 to get a sense of the up-to-date, the state-of-the-art, modern ideas about deaf education, or really anything. And so for some people who are really in the field, it might be just inexcusable, impossible to watch this movie that just touts sort of a tradition that's now seen as really preposterous and outdated. But for most people, I think that it's interesting to see this old style of education. It's probably just a good idea to have to be vaguely aware that this isn't how things are done anymore. But for the most part, you can maybe view that independently from the movie, I think. And this is actually an interesting idea about 1950s movies in general, because there's a lot that can get in the way of appreciating an old movie. 50s is a long time ago, and a lot has changed. And I think that some people who come to older movies like that, hoping to find the sensibilities of today, hoping to find characters that they agree with and situations that they agree with, are sometimes disappointed. And that's not to say that these people are silly. Like, these are legitimate difficulties in watching old things. But I think this is kind of an interesting metaphor for it, is the hearing, the deaf education that's totally out of whack. Like I said, probably we're not coming to 50s movies to get the sense of modern education. And similarly, you might watch this movie and think, wow, the relationship that the couple has with each other, totally out of whack. I think it kind of is. But again, hopefully we're not watching 1950s movies to think, here's how we should, get married today, and here's how we should live as a family. It's different. One potential virtue of movies is for being interesting. Old movies are interesting in what they show us about how the world used to be and about how things have changed. But should I talk about the actual movie? Perhaps. So this is a 50s movie. It's a melodrama. There's going to be something dramatic will happen, then there'll be a big musical cue, dun, dun, dun kind of thing. And that can be kind of jarring. The style is, really of a time. And if you're not really used to that, I think there are much better 50s movies to start with. There's lots of great movies from that era that are awesome movies that are not just good because they're interesting and about the past, but they're great on their own, exciting, interesting, and cool. This movie, I think, is maybe something more for people who've seen some 50s movies and want to see something a bit different. So this movie is British. Alexander McKendrick, I think, was a British director, but he would eventually come to the United States. He made a movie, The Sweet Smell of Success, I think was his most famous movie, which is really great. It's got Burt Lancaster in it. Now that I think is an American movie, but this is a British movie. So it doesn't have quite the same stifling, melodramatic nature that some sort of American movies from the mid-50s would. And really the two things that set this movie apart, I think, are somewhat unconventional dramatic devices using the deafness, and also a surprising amount of complexity and a surprising amount of sort of snags that are hit as the parents try to sort out exactly what to do about this. So one of the interesting arcs of the movie is that what to do about the daughter, Mandy, is something that divides the couple, the Garlands, who are sort of some of the main characters in the movie. A lot of 1950s movies have a very sort of prescriptive understanding of a relationship, right? A lot of these movies are about couple formation, as in you start out a movie with two single people and the tension is resolved when a couple is formed or when the family unit is restored, right? That's a classic sort of meta-narrative of movies from the 40s and the 50s. It's the restoration of the family unit or the creation of couples, the pairing off of man and woman. This movie starts, might follow some of those similar things in some ways, but I think it also gives a much more sort of frank and raw assessment of some of these relationships, because having a deaf child puts a huge strain on the relationship of the main couple in this movie. In the beginning, they don't really realize that anything is wrong. They just assume their child is a bit slow. There's another great 50s idea for you. And then they slowly begin to realize, hey, wait a minute, we're clapping behind her. She's not noticing things. Maybe she can't hear anything. And when they realize that, they basically, the first thing they do is they go to Google and they say, what should we do about this? No. It would be a few more years before the internet would come around. And so they turn to just sort of their preconceived ideas about deafness, and what they immediately assume is that the child will be, as they say, a dumb child who will basically go nowhere in life, and they try to shelter her. Particularly the husband wants to keep Mandy indoors, doesn't want to expose her to other children, doesn't want to expose her to the world because he's afraid of her. And this is hypothetically coming from a position of care and love, but it's totally opposed to the theory that the wife begins to develop, which is that they should try to educate her, and eventually that they should take her to this school. And that conflict between the husband and wife goes on to define the entire movie, and it's a pretty interesting conflict, because in a lot of 1950s movies, the husband and wife don't have sort of such sincere disagreements about how to raise a child, right? Maybe you would see plots about like, oh, the husband thinks the wife is cheating on him or something like that, which that happens in this movie. But maybe the movie would be centered around those sort of classic melodramatic hooks. But the sort of deeper introspection about how to properly raise a family that seems to take place in this movie is a bit uncommon. And in a lot of ways, I think the movie is surprisingly raw and allows a surprising amount of vulnerability, I would say, for the mother, and to some extent for the father, but it sort of manifests itself in a different way. Now, in some ways, this might be the legacy of so-called women's pictures of the 1940s, which are hugely focused on maternal sacrifice and whatnot. And this movie does have some of its roots sort of in the tearjerker woman's picture of the 40s, but I think it builds on that a little bit. That'd be a movie like Stella Dallas or something along those lines. But anyway, like I said, there is a fair amount of rawness in this movie that is a bit uncommon, but let's calibrate the scales here a little bit, because it's uncommon for a 1950s movie, and if you're not if you're not really in tune with that, then I wouldn't say you should go into expecting this a huge amount of subtlety or anything along those lines. And in fact, there's a number of places where it's quite hard to get to orient your emotional compass, your empathetic compass, I would say. There are a number of places, like when the mother in the beginning says, oh, well, our child's going to be dumb, whereas a contemporary viewer, it's a bit hard to understand where you should exist in relation to that statement, right? now in the 1950s, maybe a viewer would be empathetic with the mother for thinking that she'll have a dumb child, but the main thing that we think when we see that now is, well, that's not correct, and that's not a very that's an interesting attitude towards child rearing and towards deafness or disability in general. So there are a number of moments like that take a bit of reorienting, or where it will just take a little bit longer than average maybe to get your empathetic bearings in the movie. But it's easy enough as the movie gets on, certain characters to develop more into villains, and the tear-jerkery nature of it comes to the fore more. So how does that work? Well, like I said, one of the things that's cool about this movie is that it has sort of an uncommon dramatic device, and that is the deafness of Mandy, right? So there are a lot of interesting scenes in the movie where someone will be speaking to Mandy or something, and you begin to hear it. You start out with some sort of third-person perspective, and you can hear everything that's going on in the scene, but they switch to Mandy's point of view, and the sound will cut out and whatnot. And that's sort of, maybe that's like film school 101 or something. Doesn't sound that cool, but I think it is a bit unique the way that's handled in this movie, and it actually ends up being pretty compelling. And in general, this idea of having the poor deaf girl in the movie is pretty compelling, and the movie is, it's pretty compelling. Emotional experience for you. One thing that's interesting about this movie is that a lot of the movie isn't really about Mandy learning how to deal with her disability, right? Part of the movie is, right, there are many scenes that take place in a classroom or that show Mandy with a tutor or a teacher trying to learn to say plosives or to recognize the vibration in her vocal cords as being sound, right? But a lot of the movie is about other stuff. And I have sort of mixed feelings about this, right? So there's a lot of sort of contrived plot elements that have to do with how the school is run, right? Or, like I said, there's a bit of is she having an affair plot line that develops in the movie and things like that. In some ways, this is just hugely contrived and sort of totally the least interesting part of the movie. On the other hand, there is the dramatic engine of the movie is somewhat balanced because you have the sort of emotional and empathetic sort of catalyst that is Mandy, being unable to speak, being unable to address her peers, being unable to join the world, and being constantly aggravated by that. And also, but slowly being educated, perhaps, but also being continuously endangered by these other things in the plot, right? By the feelings of her parents getting in the way, right? By the dramas at the school and with the administration and complications like that. And so the balance more or less works out, but it is a little bit heavy on the sort of 1950s melodramatic things at time. That said, there are a lot of nice, clever scenes in this movie. And overall, I think they get the dramatic balance right. So there's a couple other things worth mentioning. Music, pretty solid in this movie. Cinematography, pretty solid. Those are not really the reasons to watch it. Characters, pretty strong. I think the mother's character is pretty strong. I think the father's character is pretty strong. I think Mr. Searle, Dick Searle, who is the headmaster of the school, pretty strong character. The movie is slightly more expansive than you might expect. Like I said, you start out thinking this is a movie about a deaf girl. It ends up being about the family, which is good. It ends up being about the headmaster, which is also good. There's also a little bit of a plot line stuck in there about a new teacher who comes to the school. And there are times where it's just a good thing to be aware that the movie is slightly more sprawling than you might expect and covers a little bit more ground than you might expect. The only other thing I would say, I think, is another example of sort of the oralism that's kind of interesting, is that there's a character at the school. Maybe it's good to start and end on this because it is really a huge, huge asterisk, the movie. There's a character who is one of maybe like the headmistress of the school, older woman who works at the school. And you don't realize this at first, but it is revealed in a dramatic twist. This isn't too much of a spoiler, don't worry, that she is herself deaf, right? And that she's only able to communicate with... There's a scene where someone's talking to her and then she turns away, or the lips become obscured for a minute and she can't tell what they're saying. And you realize, oh, she's deaf. And that's, by the way, that's the kind of thing that movies from the 50s, movies from the 40s, older movies are really great at, those sort of moments of sort of somewhat mechanical-esque twists, showing something in a sort of a clever and sly way. So here is the moment where you sort of become aware that this woman is deaf is pretty clever. But she's seen as a proponent of, look, it turns out that you can. If you're deaf, no worries. You learn to read lips and then you learn to speak and everything is going to be okay. That is the oralism in a nutshell, and the results of that are suspect these days. And lip reading, speech reading, I think it's just known, is these days I think not seen as quite the panacea, the cure-all that it once was. I think that even in popular culture today, people maybe overestimate how effective lip reading really is. One thing that's somewhat telling is that forensic lip readers, like professional lip readers, who participate in trials, who submit testimony to court, that testimony is often not admissible or is viewed as not very strong evidence because the reliability of professional lip readers, who usually are deaf, especially when covering conversations that are out of context, is really not that great. But like I said, this movie goes all in on the oralism and shows that really as the way, which, it is what it is, something to be aware of when you watch the movie. But like I said, this, if you like 1950s movie, bit of an uncommon movie because unconventional dramatic engine and a surprisingly complex plot where there are always a couple sort of new issues. The characters really are split on what to do about their child. They really are put under strain. You see that. It's there's some remarkably empathetic moments in it, and the overall dramatic dynamo of the deaf child works pretty well. So it produces, in general, a pretty interesting movie that I think is worth seeing. This is a movie that's part of the underrated Uncommon Movies series, and so I forget what the ratings are on IMDb, but like under 1,000 votes on this movie, which is a bit surprising because it is an interesting movie and a pretty compelling movie overall. So I would maybe recommend this if you've seen some 1950s movies and you have a bit of a sense of what the 50s movies are like and you want to see something a little bit different in that genre, but still clearly a melodramatic 50s movie, but a little bit more interesting, then maybe you should check out Mandy, also known as A Crash of Silence, directed by Alexander McKendrick from 1952. It's pretty good.